this is a book that's that is about America. I mean, it's about the American creation myth. It's about where the sort of like fundamental mythologies and sort of dreams we have about ourselves come from, and that is the frontier. This idea that you could go into this wilderness or unclaimed land, and through hard work and sort of like flintiness, make a name for yourself. The part that is left out of that mythology is that we were taking the land from someone at every inch of it, right? The North America had been settled for 15,000 years when modern Europeans land there. Every inch of the continent was claimed. People were happily living there long before us. But that is something that Americans have not quite come to terms with yet, and we need to. And hopefully this book put some sort of a context, to our history that I think is not, at least popularly, not part of the sort of discussion yet. I realize all the time that my original conceptions for books are always terrible. They're always weak. They're always cliche. It's only what comes after working for a couple of years on something that's when you sort of get to the sort of meat of it. With this book, I'd moved to Texas for graduate school in 2005, which is where the schools at the Michener Center is where I wrote American Rust. And during the 3 years I was there as a student, I began to have the sense that Texas was quite important to the sort of American narrative, to the American mythology. I just had a sense that Texas was important. And the first drafts of The Sun, there were about 10 characters. It was mostly set in the modern day. So it was set, J.A., Jean Ann was a main character, Peter was a main character. My sort of thoughts at first were that the book had a lot to do with Texas's sort of relationship to American foreign policy, especially our energy policy, our oil policy, because the ties between Texas and the Middle East are very, very, very strong. You have lots of Saudi Arabian guys living in these small towns in the middle of nowhere in West Texas, raising their kids because there's oil in those towns, in Midland, places like that. And so I at first thought, this book has a lot to do with the modern day. And the story I'm trying to tell is the sort of like how Texas influences American foreign policy, let's say. What I realized after sort of going down that road for about probably 2 years, writing, thousands of pages, was that the thing I was trying to get at, the sort of American mythology or this Texas mythology, this sort of like creation myth of America, where do we come from and what do we come from, could not be told through that lens. It fundamentally had to be told by going back in time to the time of the frontier. After a few years of writing, I realized, okay, I actually have to go back into the past. I can't just be telling this story mostly in the present day. That's when Eli McCulloch came up, and that's when I realized that what I was going to be doing in The Sun was going to be telling the story of these 7 generations of this family. Focusing really on 3, Eli, his son Peter, and then you fast forward a few generations to Jean Ann, to GAA. When you're writing a sort of multi-point of view book like this, where each chapter is a different character, different point of view, you sort of have to write a few drafts to get the overall arc and to finish the story. Keeps changing, of course, after that. And then you you only write the sections of, so I'd only write Eli. So chapter 1, chapter 4, chapter 7, chapter 10, so I just alternate like that throughout the whole book. Then I do Peter, skipping everyone else, and then I do J.A. Otherwise, the voices bleed into each other, and you end up losing control of the way they sound. Jay's voice sort of came first. Eli's voice, I was not sure what it was going to be. Well, I didn't know he was going to be a character until about 2.5 years in. And I sort of knew he was going to have this sort of old-timey speech, but I was very reluctant to sort of go down the Cormac McCarthy road of having this sort of like high biblical speech. Unfortunately, people did speak that way to some extent in the old days. So for Eli, I found a bunch of old dictionaries of slang from the 19th century. So one was from 1855, another one was from 1880, give or take. And these were books of slang, what was considered slang in the year 1855, in the year 1880, in the West and in America more broadly. And I would read those at night and take notes of words that were interesting or phrases that were interesting, those things that were musical. And so I just ended up with these stacks and stacks of scribbled, completely unorganized, like interesting words. And I would read them in the morning before I would start to write. The problem was I would sort of read the definitions, and that would take me out of the writing mode. So I ended up rewriting that list so it was just these words with no definitions. Peter, originally, because it's in diary form, I wrote as, I tried to be honest to the way, okay, this is a guy who's slightly educated, 1915, grew up, actually was born while the frontier was open, and grew up in the 1870s, 80s, 90s. How would he write? Well, the answer is he would write in a fairly boring and awful way. And so the early drafts of the book, Peter's voice was very accurate to what I thought a man of this time would actually, not what he would say, but the way he would actually write. And so it was very difficult to read because it was quite boring. And then began to think why, I began to think about why Peter's voice wasn't working. And so what are the big first person narratives that work and sort of are voicey and interesting? And Nabokov was sort of what jumped to mind, and I realized, like Lolita, Humbert does not write the way Humbert would write. Humbert writes like Nabokov. He speaks like Nabokov, and this is true for Pale Fire and everything else Nabokov did. They're completely disconnected from the reality of what that character would say on paper, right? So they're actually what the author would say. So realizing that freed me up to say, okay, I can make Peter's voice more interesting, because you're not actually writing the way Peter would write. I'm writing, in my sort of interpretation of it. Once you sort of hear a phrase or a page or a few pages of writing in a voice that works, the voice is both honest to that character, and it also is it sort of fits with your narrative and your story. It fits with what you're trying to get at. Because if the voice is good, but it doesn't work as part of the narrative, you can't use it. Research is like it's like this very seductive thing that for many writers, because it feels like work, but it's actually not work. Work is sitting at your desk and writing. And the other thing is that, at least for me, I think for most writers, the research part of your mind, sort of scientific part, is completely separate from the part that is sort of generative and creative. And in fact, it drowns it out. So when you're doing research, I actually cannot write creatively. I can try, but what comes out is terrible. What I would do is I would write until I sort of hit the edge of my knowledge, which in the beginning came quite quickly because I didn't know that much about the subject, and then go out and research, write again, run out of, realize I didn't know enough, stop writing, research, and that sort of leapfrogging process happened 5 years. There was no grand plan for how to do it. It just was. It was literally a question of writing until I realized I didn't know what I was talking about. The research felt like work. So I was out doing something that was sort of interesting, but I didn't actually care about. And I ended up resenting some of it, also because you're running out of money too, right? So you have like you're advanced for your last book that you're burning through at a rapid rate. And then, things in life happen, you run out of money even more quickly more quickly than you thought you would. And then on top of that, oh my God, you realize this book's going to take 5 years instead of 3 years because all the research you have to do, because of the sort of expanse of it. So that was sort of a difficult process. Whatever violence there is in the book is based on it's basically based on the historical record. I mean, it's based on hundreds and thousands of very well documented cases of either Anglo-Americans in South Texas killing Mexican Americans, Anglo-Americans killing Native Americans, Native Americans killing Anglo-Americans. None of this is sort of Meyer wondering, and think about what it might have been like. And the reason that whatever violence in the book is there is that that is the truth of this period of time in American history. The Comanches were a warrior society. They were quite brutal to their enemies, and which we were as well. I mean, there was actually no difference. It's just that we're careful to document the brutality that was done by our enemies, and careful to whitewash the brutality that you actually have to read between the lines to see the awful things that we did. But it's pretty clear once you do that. So it wasn't consciously important to me. It simply was so part of that time that I guess I didn't feel like I could tell the story without having that violence in there. I don't feel like the book, there are dark moments in the book, but I think, Jeannie says this once, if you look throughout human history, history is just full of massacres, and the sort of blood that was spilled in history would fill every river and ocean on the earth. But that's actually not the point. That's something that we all know, but we prefer to forget. The important point is that despite all that, here we are. We keep living our lives. We keep going out. We fall in love. We have children. And it's the sort of very weak thinking to focus on the brutality in history and think that this is what humans are made for and destined for. We know that across every race, class, whatever continent your ancestors are from, people treated other people exactly in the same way. They could be just as brutal. But the point is that here we all are now, despite that.